Never in my life did I imagine a single dinner could shatter everything I believed about family, about love, about my own worth. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I remember that Tuesday night vividly. The aroma of roasted chicken, usually comforting, felt like a suffocating blanket. I sat across from my parents, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the dining room chandelier, looking utterly serene. Yet beneath that placid surface, a storm was brewing, one that would redefine betrayal for me. My father, a man I'd always admired for his quiet strength, cleared his throat. "Eleanor," he began, his voice surprisingly devoid of warmth, "your mother and I have been discussing your situation." My heart pounded, a frantic drum against my ribs. I'd just lost my job, a position I'd poured 5 years of my life into, and their concern, I thought, was about my well-being. How naive I was. My mother, usually the picture of maternal affection, offered a saccharine smile. "It's just," she purred, "we're worried about you. Always so directionless." The words hit me like a physical blow. Directionless? I'd put myself through college, worked 2 jobs to pay off student loans, and supported them through my father's brief illness. Yet, in their eyes, I was simply a burden. The air thickened with unspoken accusations. I tried to defend myself, to explain the unfairness of my recent layoff, but my voice seemed to vanish. Then my father leaned forward, his eyes, usually kind, now cold and distant. "How does it feel, Eleanor?" he sneered, his voice dropping to a low, cutting whisper. "To be utterly useless." The world tilted. Useless. The word echoed in the sudden silence, bouncing off the walls of the dining room, embedding itself deep within my soul. My mother nodded in agreement, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on her lips. It wasn't just a casual insult, it was a surgical strike, aimed directly at the deepest insecurity I possessed. Every sacrifice, every late night, every penny I'd sent their way, it all dissolved into nothingness. In that moment, something inside me snapped. The resentment, a quiet ember I hadn't even recognized, ignited into a raging inferno. I looked at them, truly looked at them, and saw strangers. These weren't the loving parents who'd tucked me in at night or cheered me on at school plays. These were 2 people who saw me as an inconvenience, a failure, a source of embarrassment. A chilling realization washed over me, their constant advice, their subtle digs, their thinly veiled criticisms. It wasn't concern. It was a calculated campaign of psychological warfare. They wanted me small, dependent, and under their thumb. The betrayal was absolute, a gaping wound in my chest. A strange calm descended upon me, a cold clarity. I took a slow breath, the scent of the uneaten chicken now sickeningly sweet. My voice when it came was steady, almost eerily so. "Just one question," I asked, my gaze unwavering, locking onto my father's suddenly uneasy eyes. "Why?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history, years of subtle slights, and a lifetime of unacknowledged pain. Their smug expressions faltered. My mother's smile vanished. For the first time, I saw a flicker of discomfort, a hint of fear, in their eyes. They had expected tears, arguments, perhaps even a breakdown. They had not expected a challenge. That single question, simple yet loaded, was the turning point. It wasn't just about that night. It was about every slight, every dismissal, every time they had chipped away at my confidence. What they didn't know was that their cruel words hadn't broken me. They had forged me. That moment, sitting at that dinner table, staring into the abyss of their contempt, I made a silent vow. A vow to not just survive, but to thrive, to rise so high that their sneers would be nothing but distant echoes. You're about to witness a journey of obsession, a relentless pursuit of not just success, but of a specific kind of justice. This isn't a story of mere achievement, it's a detailed account of how a single question, born from the deepest pain, became the catalyst for an unimaginable transformation. You will see how I meticulously planned every step, how I faced down impossible odds, and how the very people who tried to bury me eventually became unwilling spectators to my triumph. What happened next will shock you, because sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't loud or violent. Sometimes it's just living your best life, leaving those who doubted you in the dust, wondering how on earth you did it. And trust me, they did wonder. My name is Elias Thorne. For years I'd lived under a cloud, a permanent shadow cast by my parents' disdain. Dinner at their opulent, sterile home was never a meal. It was a performance, a relentless interrogation where I was always the accused. That particular evening, the crystal chandelier above the mahogany table seemed to mock me, its glittering facets reflecting only my own growing resentment. My mother, Eleanor, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and unforgiving as her words, delicately dabbed her lips with a linen napkin. Across from her, my father, Richard, a titan of industry with a gaze that could wither lesser men, watched me with an almost clinical detachment. "Elias," Richard began, his voice a low rumble that always preceded a storm, "your sister, Clara, just secured another major account for the firm. She's truly a natural, a credit to the family name." He paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air. Clara, my younger sister, was their golden child, the prodigy who effortlessly excelled in everything I stumbled through. Her successes were always thrown in my face, a constant reminder of my perceived failures. Eleanor chimed in, her tone dripping with feigned sympathy. "It must be difficult for you, dear, seeing her thrive. After all, your endeavors haven't exactly panned out, have they?" She smiled, a brittle, joyless expression that never quite reached her eyes. "My latest endeavor was a small, independent tech startup, a passion project I'd poured my heart and meager savings into. To them, it was a childish fantasy, a foolish distraction from the preordained path they'd laid out for me, a path I'd stubbornly refused to follow. The air grew thick with unspoken judgment. I could feel the familiar knot tightening in my stomach, the old wounds reopening. My parents had always viewed my artistic inclinations, my entrepreneurial spirit, as weaknesses, proof of my inherent lack of ambition. They were self-made, ruthless, and saw the world in stark black and white, success or failure, strength or uselessness. There was no room for nuance, no appreciation for anything that didn't generate immediate tangible wealth or power. "Tell us, Elias," Richard pressed, leaning forward slightly, his eyes boring into mine. "How does it feel to be useless?" The word hung in the air, a venomous dart aimed directly at my core. It wasn't a question, it was a declaration, a deliberate attempt to wound, to diminish. Eleanor nodded, her expression confirming her agreement with his brutal assessment. A strange calm settled over me then, a cold clarity. For years I had absorbed their barbs, internalized their criticisms, letting their words chip away at my self-worth. But something shifted that night. The familiar sting of humiliation was replaced by a simmering anger, a resentment that had been brewing for decades finally reaching a boiling point. Their cruelty wasn't just a personality quirk, it was a deliberate strategy, a way to keep me subservient, to ensure I never truly escaped their control. I looked from my father's sneering face to my mother's cold, triumphant smile. Their faces, so alike in their self-satisfaction, suddenly seemed grotesque, masks of entitlement and disdain. The years of emotional abuse, the constant comparisons to Clara, the relentless belittling, it all coalesced into a single burning realization. They didn't want me to succeed on my own terms. They wanted me to fail, to be dependent, to be a perpetual disappointment they could control. My voice, when it came, was steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging within me. "Just one question," I said, meeting Richard's gaze directly. "Do you ever wonder why I stopped trying to make you proud?" The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's smile faltered, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. But for the first time, I saw not just anger, but a hint of something else. Perhaps a momentary crack in his impenetrable facade. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. That question, simple as it was, had pierced their carefully constructed narrative. It wasn't an accusation, but a statement of fact, a quiet rebellion. That night, as I drove away from their perfectly manicured estate, the resentment that had festered within me transformed. It hardened into something resolute, something dangerous. I wasn't just hurt anymore, I was determined. Their cruelty had planted a seed, and now it was beginning to sprout. I saw their perfect world, their flawless public image, and a single thought crystallized in my mind. They had built their empire on my broken spirit, and it was time to collect. My startup, my useless endeavor, suddenly felt like a weapon, a tool for a different kind of success, one they would never see coming, and one that would shatter their illusion of control. The game had changed. My resentment was now a blueprint for something far more significant, far more destructive than they could ever imagine. Their empire was built on my broken spirit, and the time had come to collect. My startup, my useless endeavor, suddenly felt like a weapon, a tool for a different kind of success, one they would never see coming, and one that would shatter their illusion of control. The game had changed. My resentment was now a blueprint for something far more significant, far more destructive than they could ever imagine. I left their sterile mansion that night, the cold night air a welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. My head throbbed, but a new kind of clarity was settling in. For too long I had tried to earn their approval, to fit into their rigid mold of what success looked like. Their constant belittling, their thinly veiled contempt, had chipped away at my confidence, leaving me feeling perpetually inadequate. But that night, their sneers had ignited something else entirely, a fierce, unyielding resolve. I wouldn't just prove them wrong. I would dismantle their carefully constructed world, piece by agonizing piece. The next morning, I walked into my small, cluttered office, the scent of stale coffee and ambition hanging in the air. My team of 5 looked up, a mix of exhaustion and hopeful anticipation on their faces. We had been running on fumes, fueled by passion and ramen noodles, trying to make our niche tech platform, Nexus, a reality. Nexus wasn't just an app, it was a vision. It was designed to disrupt the very industry my father Richard dominated, a complex web of outdated, inefficient systems that thrived on exclusivity and high fees. He saw it as stable, I saw it as stagnant. "We're changing gears," I announced, my voice steady despite the tremor of excitement in my chest. "No more playing safe. We're going for broke." Their eyes widened. They knew what that meant. It meant sleepless nights, impossible deadlines, and a relentless pursuit of perfection. But they also saw the fire in my eyes, a fire that had been missing for months. They were loyal, not just to the project, but to me, the underdog who believed in something bigger than profit margins. My first target was their firm's most vulnerable flank, their outdated client management system. Richard prided himself on his meticulous control, but his systems were ancient, a relic of a bygone era. Clara, for all her brilliance, was still operating within the confines of those very systems. I knew if I could expose their inefficiencies, if I could offer a superior, more agile alternative, I could siphon off their smaller, more forward-thinking clients, the ones they considered insignificant, but who represented the future. I spent weeks immersed in data, analyzing their public-facing reports, studying their acquisition strategies, and even discreetly networking with former employees. I discovered their reliance on legacy software, the very software my team was building a more intuitive, AI-driven alternative to. The irony was delicious. Richard, the master of innovation in his prime, had become complacent, blinded by his past successes. My strategy was simple yet audacious. I would offer Nexus's services for free to a select group of their mid-tier clients, the ones who felt overlooked by the monolithic firm. It was a risky move, one that would drain our already meager resources, but it was a calculated risk. Once they experienced the seamless efficiency of Nexus, the superior data analytics, the personalized client interaction, they would never go back. And more importantly, they would talk. The first few weeks were a blur of coding, testing, and outreach. We worked around the clock, fueled by caffeine and the shared belief that we were building something revolutionary. Every line of code, every successful demo, felt like a small victory against the looming shadow of my parents' expectations. I remembered Eleanor's condescending smile, Richard's dismissive wave of his hand. Their voices echoed in my mind, not as a deterrent, but as a relentless motivator. One evening, after a particularly grueling 20-hour day, I received an anonymous email. The subject line simply read, "A word of caution." The body of the email contained detailed, highly confidential information about a major upcoming merger my father's firm was pursuing. It outlined their acquisition targets, their financial projections, and even their contingency plans. My heart pounded as I read through the document. This wasn't just a leak, it was an inside job. Someone within my father's inner circle was feeding me information. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Who would do this? And why? Was it a trap? Or was someone else, perhaps another victim of Richard's ruthless ambition, seeking to bring him down? The information was incredibly valuable, a strategic advantage I hadn't dared to dream of. It could allow me to anticipate their moves, to counter their plays before they even made them, but it also plunged me into a deeper, darker game than I had anticipated. This wasn't just about proving myself anymore, it was about survival in a cutthroat world where the stakes were infinitely higher. The blueprint for destruction was now being drawn with far more precision, far more ruthlessness than I had ever imagined. The game had just gotten real. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, a cold, hard truth that solidified the shifting sands beneath my feet. This wasn't just about my parents' disapproval or their relentless need to control. It was about something far more insidious, a calculated game they had been playing my entire life. The realization that their disappointment was merely a carefully crafted tool, a weapon to keep me in line, ignited a new kind of fire within me. It wasn't just resentment anymore. It was a burning, furious indignation. They hadn't just dismissed my dreams, they had actively sabotaged them, all while cloaked in the guise of parental concern. I remembered countless instances, seemingly innocuous at the time, that now clicked into place with chilling precision. The accidental misplacement of my art school applications, the sudden loss of funding for my first tech prototype, the subtly worded warnings about the unstable nature of my chosen path. Each setback, each moment of self-doubt I'd experienced, hadn't been a natural consequence of my choices, but a carefully orchestrated push, guiding me back towards the corporate cage they'd built. Richard, my father, with his placid smile and steel-trap mind, had been the architect of my gilded prison, and Eleanor, my mother, the diligent warden, ensuring every bar remained firmly in place. The game, as I now understood it, wasn't just about making me conform, it was about breaking my spirit, eroding my confidence, until I was pliable enough to fit their mold. They wanted a successor, yes, but not a true heir. They wanted a puppet, an extension of their own ambition, devoid of any independent will. The thought made my blood run cold, then boil. I had been so naive, so desperate for their approval, that I'd allowed myself to be manipulated, gaslit, into believing my own failures were inherent rather than engineered. My initial plan, born of wounded pride, had been simple: prove them wrong, succeed on my own terms. But that was a child's fantasy. This new understanding demanded a far more sophisticated strategy. I needed to play their game, but with my own rules, my own objectives. I began to watch them, not as their son, but as an opponent. Every conversation, every seemingly casual comment became a data point, I analyzed their routines, their alliances, their vulnerabilities, their world, once an impenetrable fortress of power and influence, slowly began to reveal its cracks. I noticed the subtle shifts in Richard's demeanor when discussing certain business rivals, the way Eleanor's perfectly composed facade would falter when her charitable foundation's funding was questioned. They were not invincible gods, merely very skilled players, and like any game, theirs had weaknesses. My advantage, I realized, was that they still saw me as the useless son, the easily dismissed variable. They would never suspect the extent of my awakening, the depth of my resolve. The first step was to build my own arsenal. Quietly, meticulously, I started reaching out to old contacts, former colleagues who had seen the raw potential in my early projects before my parents' interference had choked them out. I reconnected with university professors who had championed my unconventional ideas. I devoured books on corporate strategy, legal loopholes, and the art of the hostile takeover. I wasn't just learning, I was transforming. The naive idealist was being shed, replaced by a pragmatist, a strategist, someone willing to fight fire with fire. There was a particular evening, a charity gala my parents hosted, where the transformation truly began. I stood in the opulent ballroom, a sea of familiar faces, all smiling, all superficial. Richard, holding court near the grand staircase, caught my eye and offered a dismissive nod. Eleanor, across the room, engaged in a vibrant conversation, barely spared me a glance. In that moment, surrounded by the very world they had tried to force upon me, I felt a profound sense of detachment. I wasn't part of their game anymore. I was observing it, preparing to dismantle it from within. My sister, Clara, approached me, her eyes sparkling with genuine warmth, a stark contrast to our parents' cold calculation. "Elias," she said, her voice soft, "you seem different tonight." I smiled, a real smile, but one laced with a new kind of resolve. "Perhaps," I replied, "I'm finally learning to play the game." She looked at me, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes, and I knew then that she too was a pawn in their elaborate scheme, albeit a more favored one. My strategy would need to account for her unwitting role in their machinations. This wasn't just about my personal revenge. It was about reclaiming my life, and perhaps freeing Clara from the same gilded cage. The stakes had been raised, and I was ready to play. The weeks that followed were a blur of calculated moves and sleepless nights. My obsession had taken root, growing into a formidable force that consumed my every waking thought. I delved deeper into the intricate web of my parents' business dealings, unearthing layers of financial maneuvering that would make even the most seasoned sharks blanch. Their empire, built on a foundation of ruthless ambition, had vulnerabilities I was now expertly dissecting. Clara, unknowingly, became my unwitting informant. Her innocent enthusiasm for her work, her genuine pride in the firm's successes, provided me with key insights. She'd mention offhand details about a new client, a tricky negotiation, or a sudden shift in strategy, all of which I meticulously cross-referenced with the data I was compiling. One evening, a particularly frustrating dead end in the financial records led me to a dusty old file box in my own attic, long forgotten. Inside, among childhood drawings and faded photographs, I found a stack of old letters. They were from my grandmother, my mother Eleanor's mother, addressed to my father, Richard. I remembered her as a kind, gentle woman, a stark contrast to Eleanor's icy demeanor. The letters spoke of early struggles, of a small family business that Richard had taken over, a business that had been the cornerstone of their initial wealth. But as I read on, a chill snaked down my spine. The tone shifted. My grandmother expressed concern, then outright fear, about Richard's aggressive expansion tactics, his willingness to cut corners, to exploit loopholes. She wrote about a specific incident, a land deal that had ruined a local family, driven them out of their home and livelihood. Richard, she implied, had been directly responsible, orchestrating the whole thing, A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't just about my perceived failures or their emotional manipulation. This was about something far more sinister. My parents weren't just emotionally detached, they were morally bankrupt. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Their self-made empire wasn't built on ingenuity, but on the systematic dismantling of others. This wasn't justice I sought anymore, it was retribution. I had to expose them, not just for my sake, but for every nameless, faceless person they had crushed underfoot on their ascent to power. The next step was clear. I needed undeniable proof, something that couldn't be dismissed as a disgruntled son's accusations. The old letters were a starting point, but I needed more. I began to focus on the land deal my grandmother mentioned. It took weeks of digging through archaic public records, archived newspaper articles, and obscure legal documents. I spent hours in the musty basements of county courthouses, poring over microfiche, my eyes burning from the strain. Finally, I found it. A series of property transfers, a shell corporation, and a suspiciously low sale price. The signatures, though faint, were unmistakably Richard's. The evidence was mounting, piece by agonizing piece. I discovered a pattern. A series of smaller companies, acquired under dubious circumstances, then systematically stripped of their assets. Their former owners, often small business owners, were left destitute, while Richard's firm absorbed their market share and client base. It was a brutal, calculated strategy, masked by layers of corporate jargon and legal complexities. The sheer scale of their deception, the cold, clinical precision of their operations, was breathtaking. They weren't just shrewd, they were predators. My focus narrowed. The upcoming annual shareholders meeting. It was a highly anticipated event, a public display of their power and success. Richard always delivered a rousing speech, painting a picture of innovation and ethical leadership. This year, it would be different. I envisioned the scene, the hushed anticipation, the sea of expectant faces, and then, the moment I would unleash the truth. The thought sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. This wasn't just about my revenge. It was about exposing the rot at the core of their gilded world. I meticulously prepared my presentation, cross-referencing every date, every signature, every financial transaction. I practiced my delivery, honing my words, ensuring they would land with maximum impact. There would be no room for error, no stutter, no hesitation. The stakes were too high. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was an ambush, meticulously planned and executed. I would use their own stage, their own audience, to dismantle their carefully constructed facade. The closer the date loomed, the more intense my focus became. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, replaced by the relentless pursuit of justice. The resentment had morphed into a burning desire for retribution, an obsession that now defined my existence. The final showdown was imminent, and I was ready. The day finally arrived, cloaked in a false sense of normalcy. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, had arranged their annual charity gala, a glittering spectacle designed to showcase their philanthropy and power. This year, however, it would serve a different purpose entirely. I arrived fashionably late, a calculated move to ensure my entrance drew just enough attention without appearing desperate. The grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel hummed with the low murmur of affluent conversations, the clinking of crystal, and the soft strains of a live orchestra. Every face I recognized was a testament to my parents' influence, a network of power players, socialites and sycophants. I spotted Richard first, holding court near the opulent marble bar, his silver hair catching the light, his tailored suit exuding an aura of untouchable authority. Eleanor was by his side, a vision in emerald green, her laughter tinkling like wind chimes, a sound that always grated on my nerves. They were a picture of success, a carefully curated image of a family built on unwavering principles and unblemished reputation. Tonight, that image would shatter. My heart hammered against my ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation. This wasn't about anger anymore, not purely. It was about precision, about striking at the very foundation of their carefully constructed world. I had spent months, years even, meticulously gathering every piece of evidence, every whisper, every hidden truth. The anonymous tips I'd orchestrated to various regulatory bodies had begun to bear fruit, small tremors in the seemingly unshakable edifice of their empire. The initial investigations had been quiet, almost imperceptible, but they were gaining momentum. I moved through the crowd, exchanging perfunctory greetings, my eyes never truly leaving Richard and Eleanor. I watched them, observed their easy confidence, their subtle nods of command, their comfortable dominion over this gilded cage. They saw me, of course. Richard offered a curt nod, a dismissive acknowledgement. Eleanor gave me a tight, almost pitying smile. They still saw the useless son, the failed entrepreneur, the black sheep who couldn't quite measure up. Their condescension was a familiar, bitter taste. Then, the first ripple went through the room. A uniformed man, impeccably dressed but clearly out of place among the glittering guests, approached Richard. His badge, glinting under the chandeliers, identified him as an agent from the Securities and Exchange Commission. The orchestra faltered, a single discordant note hanging in the air. Conversations died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. Richard's brow furrowed, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he composed himself. He likely assumed it was a minor inquiry, a formality. He had always been adept at navigating such nuisances. I moved closer, positioning myself where I could observe without drawing direct attention. The agent spoke in a low, even tone, but the words carried in the sudden hush. "Mr. Thorne, we have a warrant for the immediate seizure of your company's financial records. We also require your presence for questioning regarding allegations of significant financial impropriety, including insider trading and money laundering." The color drained from Richard's face. His usual composure cracked, revealing a raw, visceral shock. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her emerald dress suddenly seeming less vibrant, more like a shroud. The murmurs in the room erupted into a cacophony of whispers, gasps, and frantic phone calls. The carefully constructed facade began to crumble, piece by agonizing piece. Richard, regaining a fraction of his formidable presence, scoffed. "This is preposterous. A misunderstanding. You have no idea who I am." The agent remained impassive. "We are fully aware, Mr. Thorne. The evidence presented to us is substantial. Your personal assets are also subject to immediate freeze." That's when it hit them, the true magnitude of the disaster. Not just a minor legal skirmish, but a full-blown assault on their very existence, their wealth, their reputation, their carefully cultivated image, all under siege. I watched as Richard's eyes darted around the room, meeting the shocked, then rapidly judging, stares of his esteemed guests. Their faces, once admiring, now held a mixture of pity and schadenfreude. The network of power players, once so loyal, began to subtly distance themselves, their alliances shifting like sand in the wind. Eleanor, usually so poised, looked utterly lost. Her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. Her carefully constructed world was imploding around her. She looked at Richard, then back at the agent, then finally, her gaze landed on me. For the first time I saw not disdain, but a flicker of dawning horror, a realization of the architect behind their downfall. I met her gaze, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across my face. It wasn't a triumphant grin, but a quiet, profound satisfaction. The years of their sneers, their belittling remarks, their constant reminders of my perceived uselessness, had fueled this moment. I hadn't sought to destroy them out of petty revenge, but out of a desperate need for justice, for recognition of my own worth. Richard, his voice now a strained whisper, finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a dawning, terrifying comprehension. He saw not the failure he had always dismissed, but the architect of his ruin. The man who had meticulously dismantled everything he had built. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The powerful, unshakable Richard Thorne was, for the first time, truly speechless. The silence in the room was deafening, punctuated only by the distant wail of sirens approaching the hotel. The wail of sirens grew louder, a piercing shriek that cut through the oppressive silence in the room. Richard, still frozen, looked at me as if seeing a ghost. A specter of his past failures finally materialized. His face, usually so composed and unyielding, was a mask of disbelief, slowly crumbling into something akin to terror. He stumbled back, bumping into the ornate dining chair, sending it scraping loudly across the polished marble floor. It was a sound that, for years, had been synonymous with his authoritative presence, now reduced to a clumsy, desperate retreat. You did this, he finally choked out, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. He wasn't asking, he was stating a fact, one that had finally pierced through his impenetrable arrogance. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, darted around the room as if searching for an escape, a way to rewind time, to undo the meticulously crafted downfall I had orchestrated. But there was no escape, no undoing. This was the culmination, the final act. I watched him, a strange mix of vindication and emptiness washing over me. For so long I had dreamed of this moment, of seeing him stripped of his power, his control. Now that it was here, it felt hollow. The satisfaction was fleeting, overshadowed by the realization that the years of resentment, the burning desire for revenge, had consumed so much of me. The hotel security, alerted by the commotion and the approaching sirens, began banging on the suite door. Richard flinched, the sound jolting him from his stupor. He looked at me again, this time with a flicker of something new in his eyes, not anger, not even fear, but a desperate, almost pathetic plea. He, the man who had taught me that weakness was a cardinal sin, was now openly displaying it. "What do you want?" he rasped, his voice regaining a fraction of its former strength, though laced with a tremor I had never heard before. "What do you gain from this, Elias? You've ruined everything. Our name, our legacy? It's all gone." "Legacy?" I scoffed, the word tasting like ash on my tongue. "What legacy, Richard? A legacy built on crushing others? On dismissing anyone who didn't fit your narrow definition of success? You taught me that the world was a battlefield, and only the ruthless survived." "Well, I learned your lesson, didn't I?" The door burst open, revealing a phalanx of police officers, their faces grim, their hands on their holstered weapons. They surveyed the scene, their eyes landing on Richard, then on me. One officer, a stern-faced woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. "Richard Thorne?" she asked, her voice calm but authoritative. "We have a warrant for your arrest concerning multiple counts of corporate fraud and embezzlement." Richard's shoulders slumped. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. The fight had simply left him. As they led him away, his hands cuffed behind his back, he turned his head, catching my gaze one last time. There was no defiance, no anger, just a profound, devastating defeat. The Titan had fallen. Eleanor, who had been silently weeping in the corner, her face a blotchy mess of mascara and tears, now wailed, "Richard, no! This can't be happening!" Her carefully constructed world, built on wealth and social standing, was collapsing around her. Clara, pale and trembling, could only stare, her golden girl facade shattered. I watched them, the family that had once cast such a long, suffocating shadow over my life, now exposed, vulnerable, and utterly broken. The grand dining room, once a stage for their performances of superiority, was now a scene of their unraveling. As the police led Richard out, past the stunned hotel staff and curious onlookers, I felt a strange detachment. The burning rage that had fueled me for so long had finally extinguished, leaving behind a cold, empty space. The revenge I had meticulously planned and executed had indeed brought them to their knees, but it hadn't brought me the peace I had so desperately craved. The officers finished their questioning, taking my statement, which was concise and to the point. I had provided them with the undeniable evidence, the paper trail, the digital footprints of Richard's illicit dealings, all carefully collected over years. My useless tech skills, the very things they had mocked, had been my most potent weapons. Stepping out of the hotel into the cool night air, the flashing blue and red lights of police cars painting the street in an eerie glow, I took a deep breath. The air felt lighter, no longer thick with the weight of their judgment. I had achieved my goal. I had brought Richard down. But the victory felt hollow, a monument built on the ashes of my own bitterness. The journey had ended, not with triumph, but with a quiet understanding. Revenge, while satisfying in its execution, was a consuming fire that left nothing but scorched earth behind. It had freed me from their shadow, yes, but it had also bound me to the darkness of my own making. Moving forward, I knew my path would be different. It wouldn't be about tearing down, but about building up, about finding a purpose that filled the emptiness, not with vengeance, but with something real, something that truly mattered. The chapter of revenge was closed. Now, the story of healing, of finding true purpose, could finally begin. The silence that followed my question was deafening, a thick, suffocating blanket that settled over the polished dining table. My parents, usually so quick with a cutting remark or a dismissive wave, sat frozen, their faces a canvas of warring emotions. My father's jaw, perpetually set in a rigid line, twitched. My mother, who had always perfected the art of the condescending smirk, looked as if she'd swallowed a lemon. They had expected me to crumble, to beg for their approval, to validate their cruel assessment of my worth. Instead, I had simply held up a mirror. My gaze never wavered from my father's eyes. He cleared his throat, a small, almost imperceptible sound, then looked away, his eyes darting around the opulent dining room as if searching for an escape hatch. My mother, ever the strategist, finally broke the spell. "Richard," she began, her voice strained, "this is hardly the time for theatrics. We invited you here to discuss your future, your obvious lack of direction." I allowed a slow, deliberate smile to spread across my face. "My future? My direction?" I repeated. My voice calm, almost conversational. "Funny, I thought we were discussing yours. All those years you told me I'd amount to nothing, that I was a burden, a failure. You built your entire identity around my supposed uselessness, didn't you? It was your favorite story to tell at dinner parties, wasn't it? The cautionary tale of your disappointing son." My father slammed his fist, not hard, but with enough force to make the crystal glasses rattle. "That's enough, Richard! You have no right to speak to us that way." "No right?" I countered, leaning forward slightly, my voice still low, but with an edge of steel. "I have every right. I lived it. Every belittling comment, every sneer, every time you compared me to some distant cousin's perfect child. Do you remember the night I got into that scholarship program, the one that could have changed everything? You told me it was a fluke, that I'd never last. You crushed it before I even had a chance to breathe." My mother's face was now a sickly white. "We only wanted what was best for you," she whispered, a pathetic attempt at victimhood. "Best for me?" I scoffed, a genuine bitter laugh escaping my lips. "Or best for your image? Best for the narrative you'd meticulously crafted about your own superiority? You didn't want me to succeed, not really. Because if I did, what would that make you? What would that make all those years of cruelty mean?" The air in the room crackled with unspoken truths. My parents, who had always seemed so invincible, so sure of their dominion, looked small, exposed. My father, the titan of industry, seemed to shrink in his expensive suit. My mother, the queen of their social circle, looked utterly defeated. "You asked how it feels to be useless," I continued, my voice rising slightly, filling the room. "Well, I'll tell you. It feels like a cage. A cage built by the very people who were supposed to set you free. But I broke out of that cage. Piece by agonizing piece, I rebuilt myself. And the irony, the exquisite, beautiful irony, is that my freedom, my success, is precisely what renders you useless. I watched their faces contort with a mixture of rage and dawning comprehension. They finally understood. My success wasn't just my own triumph, it was the demolition of their carefully constructed narrative. It was the proof that their cruelty had failed, that their predictions were hollow. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the polished floor, the sound jarring in the sudden silence. "I didn't come here tonight for an apology," I said, looking from my father to my mother. "I came here to show you that the boy you tried to break, the one you called useless, found his own worth. And I found it despite you, not because of you." I turned and walked towards the door, the weight of years of resentment finally lifting from my shoulders. As I reached for the doorknob, my mother's voice, a raw, desperate plea, stopped me. "Richard, wait!" I paused, but I didn't turn around. I had nothing left to say. The confrontation had been brutal but necessary. The years of resentment had finally culminated in this moment of truth, a raw, unflinching reckoning. My obsession with proving them wrong had led me here, to this bittersweet closure. I had achieved my form of justice, not by destroying them, but by building myself up, by thriving in the face of their venom. The cost was years of pain, but the lesson learned was invaluable. True worth comes from within, not from the fleeting approval of others. I had finally set myself free. Without another word, I opened the door and stepped out, leaving the ghosts of my past behind me.